Welcome to Terabytes. Once again, a big shout out to our thumbnail editor for doing such a wonderful job. But in fact, this is episode 2, part 3, and it's called Over the Sea to Skye. Now that generally refers to taking ship from mainland Scotland to go over to Skye. But in this episode, we're going to be looking at it from the other direction. It's coming from the Outer Hebrides east towards Skye. We can see a bit clearer what I mean by over the sea to Skye. Skye's marked as Anchiel and Skye on this map, and invariably people would take ship or a ferry across the narrow straits or kyles that separate Skye from the mainland Scotland, as in Kyle Ree, Kyle Lachalsh and Kyle Akin. But in this video we're going to examine coming from the Outer Hebrides, which we can see on the left hand side of Scotland, or the west. We can also see the green roads, which represent the drove roads. There's one running from south to north on the Outer Hebrides. We can also see the green lines which cross the sea. Now these are the most common routes that were taken by the islanders to get to mainland Scotland and to the Inner Hebrides. So for example, people in Barra would be more likely to go down towards Mull, and you can see down at the bottom there Tryon Markgate, which basically just means Market Beach, where they would sell their cattle, whereas the people in the north in Lewis would most likely go from Stornoway over to Ullapool, which is indeed the route that the modern day ferry takes. But it does look like it's a solid mass from this height, but actually the Outer Hebrides are a string of islands separated by tidal sea banks, and we can see that as we zoom in more closely. So let's take a fly over the Outer Hebrides so we can have a closer look at the islands. You begin to see what I mean about a chain of islands. This is Barra Castle Bay, and there is a castle in the bay there. It's well worth a visit. As we move north to Barra, we begin to see these tidal sand banks that separate the islands. This is actually Barra Airport. The plane lands on the beach. And as we come over to Eriskay, we can once again see the route of the old drove road and the new modern causeway, but yet the people would swim their animals across these areas. And we come to Benbecula, we can see once again the same thing. It's flat tidal sandbank. These sandbanks could be dangerous. People and animals could and have been drowned by the sudden incoming tides, but this is exactly how they used to move the cattle around. They would swim them across. Even at low tide, there is invariably some swimming that would need to be done by the animals to get from one island to the next, and they still use them this is still a way of moving cattle around in many parts of Scotland and Ireland today. And from Benbecula we move to Northern Uist, where we can actually see the viewpoint looking out to the west towards Hiorsta or St Kilda, which is no longer inhabited. It was often referred to as the edge of the world because beyond that is the Americas. And once again we can see at Berneray the flat shelves of sand that separate the islands from each other. And obviously the routes that people took. And this is Nahera or Harris. It's where they make the tweed. And this is Luskintyre or Luskintyre, Luskin's land. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited. And as we move to the north, we come into Lewis, and we can see from the spelling of Lewis and Gaelic that this was the lands of the clan MacLeod, so why it's called Lewis. Directly in front is the Callanish stone circle. And as we continue further north, we come to an airy, which is Gaelic for shieling. This is the sign outside, an airy shieling. I'll read out the Gaelic for you, give you an idea of what the language sounds like. Gedis socrach mo libe, bounce a cadol e frech, aunen lagen beg wegnich, is bad den lucher however. The actual shieling itself has been restored by the local population to give you an idea of what living in a shieling would look like. Let's go and have a look. And this is the reconstructed shieling. First thing I would point out is that the Velux skylight window is it's been put in there so that you can actually see inside. It is actually a free museum for people to go in, so they've put that in. I agree with that. As we go through the door, what we're first met with is another door on the other side. In a building that doesn't have any windows, then really opening the door is the only way of getting light in during the day. And if the wind's howling straight through this door, you would close it and you would open the door on the other side of the shieling. Another thing to note is the sacking boards that have been laid across the roof beams. Originally it would have just been lengths of timber branches that washed up on the beach that would have been tied onto the roof beams, and onto that they would have thrown sods of turf and peat, which would have effectively been the roofing material. However, that although it's a very simple construction, it's actually quite labour intensive in maintaining. So I agree with what they've done here. They've actually put sacking boards on and some sort of proper roof to keep the inside dry. Another thing to look at is the actual construction of this building. It's dry stone diking or dry stone walling with alcoves set into the walls, and we can see in the top left the alcove. There's you can't see it from here, but it's a Jewish harp and a tobacco pipe and a Bible. And what it reminds me of is these are the constructions of shielings over on the east coast, and they're remarkably similar in their design. And as I said in the earlier video, what they actually reminded me of was this. This is Skye. Now Skye is not a shieling. It's a much grander construction. But the techniques in building are very, very similar. What makes Skye so grand is the Orkney and the Caithness. The type of stone there is sedimentary, and it lends itself well to being split into relatively thin large sheets, which people for centuries right across Britain used as flooring, especially in kitchens and in pubs and in bars. They call them flagging stones. You can still buy Caithness flagging stones, although they're very expensive. So from an airy, they would be taken down to the markets in Harris and Lewis, and from there they would be taken down to what they call the live rig. And you can see a number of them here in North Uist. We're going to go to a specific one. This is an Lavrig Nahiela, which means of the swan. Apparently there was a boat called the Swan that was built 300 years ago that used to use this particular area frequently, and that's why it's got this name. There are lots of lavrigs all over the west coast of Scotland. This one's actually called An Lavrig, and it's on the Isle of Eigg. But the photograph gives you a good idea of what the people are actually referring to. If you look at the rock formation to the bottom left, you can see how the rocks fall sharply down into the sea. So they would wait until the tide came in, move the boats right up next to those rocks, and from there they would be able to embark the cattle onto the boats one at a time and very carefully. And here we can see some photographs and some paintings of the cattle being loaded onto the boats themselves. Now, the cattle themselves, not all cattle would have had brass nose rings, even today. So how they would actually put the cattle into the boats is they would load them in one at a time, and they would tie their noses to the gunwale, either via the nose ring or via the rope halter round about the faces of the cattle. And this is a picture from last year from Bangladesh. Cattle are still moved in this exact same manner even today in some parts of the world. Well, we don't know exactly what type of boats the Mesolithic and the Neolithic people had, but it's 40 miles from the Inner Hebrides to the Outer Hebrides, and we find traces of Mesolithic and Neolithic activity in the Outer Hebrides, so they must have had boats of some description. Whether or not they had sails, we don't know. I think they're probably a later invention. They probably paddled their boats. But they would have been quite substantial boats. You know, it's 40 miles of open sea. It's the Atlantic. It's not suitable for a dugout canoe that you would use for paddling around Flag Fen. Perhaps they were hide-covered constructions which would be waterproofed with pitch pine. Or like the canoes on the right, this is an 18-metre long canoe. I suspect for open sea they probably would have had some sort of stabiliser, a bit like a catamaran with an outrigging to stabilise the boat from side to side. But either way, at the time of the markets, the boats would collect, and they would cut heather and put the heather into the bottom of the boats to lessen the impact of the hooves of the cattle on the boats, and also to help collect up any mess the cattle made, which would also be recycled as fertiliser. And as you can see here, the actual distance that they've got to travel, it's not for the faint-hearted or the inexperienced even today. It is open sea. Now, when they arrived at the other end, towards the island, the Isle of Skye, the cattle would be literally just tipped over the edge one at a time, or they would tie a lever across the mast with a loop on it, loop it round the cattle's horns, lift it up and tie its nose from the gunwale, and then basically just drop it into the sea. For two reasons. One, it's the easiest way to unload a boat, but also if it had been a particularly rough crossing, then it would help to clean up the cattle after such a rough crossing as they made their way onto the beach, a couple of 100 yards of swimming. So once the cattle had swum from the boats to the shore and had a nice wash, if any of the cattle had sustained damage during the crossing, i.e. been gored by the horns of another cattle, the drovers would repair these gores using angel tar, as they called it, pitch pine resin. Apart from being used for waterproofing boats, it was also used for starting fires and for hafting arrows onto arrow shafts. You can see Will Lord at the bottom. He's used pitch pine and nettle string to create a handle for a flint dagger. Often the drovers would use that opportunity to collect some of the blood from the cattle, because all drovers carried a pouch full of oats, which they would mix with the blood to create a primitive form of black pudding. And here we can see this is an actual cattle drove, probably from the late 1800s. It's a photograph going across Skye. And from the beaches, they would go to the main market stances on Skye, which were at Portree, Slagachen and Broadford. Now, it is the drovers who controlled the market effectively. So if the drovers sold the cattle at Slagachen, they would have to make enough money to pay the farmer who had given them the cattle in the first place, but also the sailors who had used their boats to transfer the cattle there, plus also for their time. They didn't just cross 40 miles of ocean with 20 cattle for fun. So each time the cattle change hands, the cost of them increase between Lewis and London. But as we look down towards Glenelg in the bottom right, we can see these narrow straits, or the Kyles as they're called. At Kyle of Loch Alshan on the other side is Kyleakin, and the one at Glenelg, or near Glenelg, is called Kyle Ree. Now, we're lucky enough that in the 1980s, some intrepid farmer from Skye decided to recreate a cattle drove. across Skye and down to Crieff, which lucky enough we've got some footage of.
In the old days, the drovers used to make their herds swim the treacherous ocean strip which separates Skye from the mainland. Kay was determined to try that too. Cattle do swim, but would these comparatively domesticated animals show much stomach for it? Would the drovers have the skill to get them across? Before risking his herd in the Atlantic Ocean, he decided to have a rehearsal in the freezing cold but comparatively quiet waters of a sea loch. You can lead a bullock to water, but you can't necessarily make him swim. At least, not in the direction you want him to go. With the help of some local fishermen, the drovers make quite a splash. In the end, the cattle decide that bracing as an October dip in a Scottish loch may be for humans, they prefer terra firma.
Seen beasts swimming certainly, but many's a time. I've never had the trick at all. This is my first go.
What we haven't really got is we haven't got a good enough leader, have we?
At the same time, the next day, the drovers try again. The theory is that in a smaller group of, say, half a dozen, the cattle will be less distracted and will swim across. That's the theory. In the event, it's the drovers who show more liking for cold water. One beast is eventually roped and towed across the loch without mishap. Despite the wet clothes and squelching boots, the drovers aren't disheartened. They have tried what many said couldn't be done, and they've nearly done it.
Well, I think we've proved it's very, very difficult. I think with wild cattle, you could, but these are too tame. They're too docile, and they're not sufficiently frightened. They won't just run into the water to get away from us. And without terrorising them in a way that they're not prepared to do, that's no good.
Times change. The old drovers, with neither the cruelty man nor contemporary niceties to contend with, were not so caring. They thought nothing of lashing one beast's jaw to the tail of the one in front and hauling them across like a shaggy, bellowing daisy chain. Several animals lost their tails in the process. There are countless stories of cattle turning on their backs and deliberately drowning themselves rather than submit to the rigours of the crossing. Nowadays, such cruelty would be unacceptable. So, in the end, like all the other modern travellers passing through, John Kay's Highland herd catched the ferry.
And this is the ferry pulling into Kylree, probably in the late 1800s. It hasn't really changed that much since then. But I think I'll end this video now. I think from now on we're going to go to the northeast of Scotland for the next video. So if you've liked this one, please smash the like button and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video.